It's my great pleasure to welcome the participants and panelists for this webinar on race and capitalism. So I'm just going to present very briefly what the University of Chicago Paris Center is, and then I'll turn it over to Michael, who is both a discussant who's going to be moderating the conversation. But we're essentially the European, or at least one of the European satellites of the University of Chicago. And we are essentially focusing our activities on three sets of things, one of which is pedagogical, which is essentially providing University of Chicago students with opportunities to take classes at our center. The other opportunity or the other axis of our activities is research oriented, and we help University of Chicago researchers essentially sort of conduct their activities and investigations when in Paris. And the final one is to essentially establish partnerships and collaborations around topics of actuality, such as the one today, with researchers both in France and Europe, which of course brings us to today's topic. Which could not be more timely given the always disquieting turns in which conversations around race in France are taking. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Michael, who's going to be moderating everything. I wanted to thank all of the panelists for having so kindly accepted to participate in the event, and we very much look forward to the fruit of your conversations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Francois. It's a pleasure to once again have a spirited discussion about race and capitalism here at the Paris Center. Albeit this is a virtual gathering, let's hope our next session will be in person. This event is co-sponsored by the University of Chicago Center in Paris, the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and the Race and Capitalism Project. The National Race and Capitalism Project was founded several years ago by faculty and graduate students at the University of Chicago and the University of Washington, excuse me. The project has worked with scholars based in Mexico, Canada, the US, and Western Europe. We are in the process of expanding our international networks. Within the US, several universities have played a central role in building the scholarly work of the project, as well as more public-facing work, including UCLA, the University of Washington, and the University of Chicago. Individual scholars from dozens of universities are affiliated with the project. We have sponsored pre- and postdoctoral fellows, several conferences, writing workshops, a podcast, and we're in the process of putting together special issues of academic journals as well as edited volumes. Today, we once again come together as part of our priority of building international ties between scholars throughout the world, working on the intersection of race and capitalism. Though in its infancy, these discussions are beginning to bear fruits. Several scholars from Mexico are working on an edited volume with us on race and capitalism in Mexico. Today's event continues the spirit of exchanging insights and engaging in debate to further intellectual inquiry into and further advance the fight against racial and other forms of injustice. Our panel today is composed of scholars based throughout Western Europe. I'm the interloper. Let me introduce our panel. Unfortunately, Professor Batu will not be with us today due to illness. Pepijn Pepijn Brandon is assistant professor at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam and senior researcher at the International Institute of Social History. His work focuses on the history of capitalism, war and economic development, and slavery. His dissertation, published in 2015 as War, Capital, and the Dutch State, 1588 to 1795, was awarded Best Dissertation of the year 2013 by the University of Amsterdam's Institute for Culture and History, and won the D.J. Vigens Award of the Royal Holland Society of Sciences and Humanities. Emily Kashiefstein is a junior research fellow in politics at St. John's College, University of Oxford. Prior to coming to the University of Oxford, Dr. Kashiefstein was the Race and Capitalism Project's pre-doctoral fellow at the University of Chicago. Her current book project traces the emergence and legacy of an actuarial conception of justice, insurance and credit markets in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and its implications for conceptions of racial justice in the present. Her research interests include critical theory, the history of Black political thought in the 19th century and 20th century, theories of racial capitalism, and normative theories of economic and social justice. Vanessa Thompson is a research associate at the Department of Comparative Cultural and Social Anthropology at the Europa Universität Viadrina Frankfurt. Her dissertation, Solidarities in Black, Anti-Black Racism and the Struggle Beyond Recognition in Paris, was awarded with the Weizsäck Prize for the best PhD thesis in social sciences and humanities at the Goethe University, Frankfurt. Vanessa Thompson's research interests include theories on racial and critical race theory, Black diaspora studies with a particular focus on Black Europe, feminist and post-colonial studies. Our discussants today, I'm one of them. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Chicago, and we're fortunate to have as our second discussant, Catherine Hall, Emerita Professor of Modern British Social and Cultural History at University College London. Her research focuses on the rethinking the relation between Britain and its empire in the 19th and 20th centuries. Catherine Hall was principal investigator of the ESRC-funded project Legacies of British Slave Ownership and of the new ASRC-funded project, The Structure and Significance of British Caribbean Slave Ownership, 1763 to 1833. She is now Chair Emerita of the Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slave Ownership. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Each panelist will have 15 minutes to present their work, and each of the discussants will offer their comments and questions. Then the panelists will be able to briefly, if they choose, respond to the discussants' questions, and we'll open it up for the audience for questions. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Brandon.
Thank you, Professor Dawson, and also thank you for the invitation to this seminar. It's wonderful to be able to be a part of this, and also to thereby have this connection to your work on race and capitalism, which are very central to my own concerns in my research. And I'll start sharing my screen because I have a small PowerPoint, mainly because I'll show some quotations during my talk. So let me bring this up. I want to get this full screen. So there you are. So I will talk about the beginnings of the Dutch involvement in slavery in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean era. And I'm mainly an economic historian of slavery and capitalism. So my work in the last couple of years has focused on the revenues drawn from slavery and how they percolated into the Dutch economy. So that has been on the forefront, but in this talk I want to think also a bit about sort of the justifications for slavery, the debate surrounding slavery, and the very early entrance of all sorts of racialized concepts in thinking about slavery for the Dutch. Now, this certainly in the Dutch case is not often done, partly because the question of the relationship between capitalism and slavery has been interpreted, I think, in many for many countries, but certainly for the Dutch, mainly as a national accounting issue. So it's an issue of finding out how much profit was made from slavery at a particular time. Now, I certainly don't think that's unimportant to do. There's major arguments revolving around this, and actually I'm part of some of these debates. A colleague of mine and I have an article in the latest issue of Slavery and Abolition, where we try to argue based on such national accounting methods that slavery actually had much more of an impact on the Dutch economy than is usually assumed in the 18th century. But in many ways, of course, this is a narrowing down of the debate in a way in which sort of many founders of this debate, and I'm thinking, of course, primarily of Eric Williams, never intended it to be. So if you think about capitalism and slavery, it's not primarily concerned with national accounting or profits. It's a book on political economy, right? And I think that is the proper framework to address this question. And because this is political economy, ideas matter a lot. Now, all these discussions, of course, are highly contentious, and for a very long time, Dutch historiography treated the entry of the Dutch into Atlantic slavery as reluctant, or even, in the phrase of a famous scholar of the Dutch Atlantic slave trade, as accidental, as a byproduct of Dutch privateering enterprise. And this historical discussion even had some repercussions last year in the course of Black Lives Matter, when the statue of Pepijn that you see here was sprayed on by Black Lives Matter activists with killer and thieves. Pepijn was an admiral of the Dutch West India Company, who was most famous for conquering a Spanish silver fleet. But the argument then that raged in the press was some very senior scholars on slavery in the Netherlands saying, well, this cannot be a relation because Pepijn was active in the 1620s and serious Dutch involvement in Atlantic slavery only started in the 1630s. So part of what I present here comes from annoyance about the ignorance that is exhibited in actually thinking that Dutch involvement in slavery only started in the 1630s. But it's worthwhile to go to the source of this. There was a debate right at the founding of the Dutch West India Company whether the Dutch West India Company should be involved in the Atlantic slave trade. And the fragment that we have of this debate is this very brief remark in the minutes of the WIC directors in a meeting of July 1623, where they say, concerning the trade in Angola, more precisely the trade in blacks, the word used is zwarten. I will come back to that word later on. Concerning the trade in Angola, this is still uncertain, while we do not have a place nor opportunity to use them in Brazil or elsewhere. And besides, it appears that this trade is not permitted for Christians. Now, much of the debate on this has focused on the second part, the religious objections to slavery. But of course, at least in this sort of company document, this is only an afterthought after the very practical remark, we do not have plantation colonies, and therefore we do not know how to be involved in the slave trade. And actually, I find this combination very frequently. And of course, once the Dutch obtained a plantation colony of any scale in the Atlantic, the moral objection quickly vanished, and this happened in the 1630s. Here we have an early newsprint with a map of Pernambuco, the first foothold in Brazil that the Dutch conquered in 1630s. And you see at the top right the sugar mill worked by enslaved laborers, already portraying this sort of what the capture of Brazil was for. This was indeed the starting point for mass involvement of the Dutch in transatlantic slavery, but it was certainly not the beginning of involvement in transatlantic slavery. So because I have so little time, I'll just say very briefly, there are these well-known texts by Dutch authors already from the start of the 17th century that discuss slavery, most famously de Marais' description of the Gold Coast, which is often seen as this almost sort of proto-ethnographic text rather than a pragmatic sort of text that was geared towards Dutch trading ventures. But the Dutch were already very well established on the Guinea coast at that point of time. In the year that Marais wrote this book, 200 ships sailed from the Netherlands to the Guinea coast, mainly not to participate in the slave trade, but in commodity trade. But the Dutch were also very involved in Atlantic sugar trade. By that time, actually, Amsterdam was the main destination for Atlantic sugar, including sugar from Portuguese colonies at that point of time. There were Dutch entrepreneurs who owned plantations in Portuguese Brazil, even though this was prohibited at many points by the Portuguese crown. The small Dutch colonies on the Guyana coast that by that time already existed, there were plantations worked both by African and by Amerindian Amerindian slaves, and that so it's hard to escape the feeling when reading these kinds of passages by the Marais that this is much more than ethnographic interest. Actually, it's already it's more like a commercial prospectus. It's really talking about human beings in this commoditized form. So here's this river, Rio de Forcados, is frequently visited by the Portuguese and is well known everywhere. Not for the virtue of the land, there we have the moral obligation, the obligatory moral commentary, not for the virtue of the land, but for the mass of slaves that are bought and sold there to bring them to other places like São Tomé and Brazil, to work there and to refine sugar, for they are very strong and pious men who can endure the labor well, and on average they are better slaves than those of Gabon, but those that are bought in Angola are even better. And then we have many of these descriptions by captains who talk more or less on the side about moments where they are in contact with slavery. And this is, of course, important because in all this sort of map making, knowledge gathering, commercial venturing that the Marais' writings are part of, their direct sort of informants are captains. So here we have the remark in Pieter van den Broeke, is a West African captain, saying the parents sometimes by force of necessity sell their children for food. In my time, I have bought a beautiful young girl of around 10 years from her mother for the value of 100 pounds of rice. Now, my main argument here is that at this very early stage already, the Dutch interest in Atlantic slavery was highly pragmatic, and with a view to take part in this. That might not be so surprising for an international audience, but it's still a major debate in the Netherlands. What I want to add to this, and this I think is severely understudied in the also in the international literature, is the enormous similarity to with the Dutch entry into slavery in the Asian context. I don't know how I'm doing for time, so I won't read out the entire quotations, but the first one is from 1603, one of the first ventures into the East Indies after the establishment of the Dutch East India Company in 1602, where the company directors give the commander, Pieter van der Hagen, very exact information about where enslaved people can be obtained, and also qualifying sort of or giving sort of qualities to the enslaved people in different locations. This was in no way sort of theoretical. Already in 1614, the infamous VOC director Jan Pieterszoon Koen advised the VOC directors to replace untrustworthy Moors, internata, with, once again, blacks, zwarten, either slaves or free, which are all capable to do the necessary labor, so that we do not have to use our own people in this. And in 1617 already, Jan Pieterszoon Koen was well immersed into organizing slave trade, both from the Coromandel coast and from Mozambique to Southeast Asia, and again describing them as we have received several sturdy blacks. Now, here I want to return briefly to this point. The word used in these early sources as either blacks, zwarten, or negros, not in the Dutchified form that it later received, but the Portuguese form. And in many of these sort of where the Dutch give information about where to trade the slaves, it's always based on Portuguese examples. The Dutch were ferocious in gathering this information from the Portuguese, and in many ways also with that took notions or ideas how to describe the enslaved people from the Portuguese, and racialized notions that existed in the in Southern Europe took them over wholesale. And one of them is this blanket use of the term negros, translated from Portuguese or even in untranslated form, as almost equivalent for slaves. Now, of course, in this citation, he says blacks, slaves or free, but it's noticeable that either blacks or negros is, I hardly ever encounter this outside a context where there's a discussion of slavery. Now, this then is connected to, and I think I have to wind up with the very first example where the Dutch created a plantation society is not in the Atlantic world, but is on the Banda Island. And I don't have time to discuss this, but I think it's crucial in the coming years to pay a lot of attention to how ideas on slavery moved back and forth at this early stage between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean area. Here we see an early map of the Banda Islands. I think in the notion of what a plantation is, the Dutch clearly sort of drew on Atlantic examples of this sort of idea of regimented gang labor on neatly organized plots of land. On the other hand, in terms of the justifications, they mixed all sorts of socio-economic arguments, political arguments, religious arguments, as well as ethnic categories, including this idea that the Negroes or black and slave would be interchangeable, which is all the more remarkable because some of the enslaved brought into the Banda Islands were indeed from Mozambique or Eastern Africa, but many were from different areas in Southeast Asia itself. Now, this was, I'm afraid, a rather rambling way to say something about the directions of my current research and thinking about sort of the emergence of involvement in racialized forms of slavery as something that was very early for the Dutch, but in many ways borrowed from Portuguese practices, and that can be sort of explained only properly in a context that is truly global and not just focused on the Atlantic, on the Atlantic side of this. And I'll stop there.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, for the invitation, Professor Dawson, Arnaud, and Francois. The presentation is entitled Policing as Method, Struggles for Black Lives as Struggles Against Racial Gendered Capitalism. Last year's global articulations of Black Lives Matters protests and Black uprisings from the US and North America to Europe, various countries on the African continent and Asia, as well as in the Caribbean, have signaled the transnational and expansive dimension of regimes of policing and punishment in the current phase of racial gendered capitalism. The protests and mobilizations have again shown that policing of Black lives is by far only a US or North American phenomenon, and that policing as part of the punitive condition unfolds globally. The killings of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Diane Johnson, and many others in the US iteratively and brutally laid bare what it means to live at the receiving end of policing since centuries. The travelings of the protests from various cities in the US to various parts in the world further showed that this condition is not reserved only to the US. Quite the contrary, protesters and vulnerable communities were standing in solidarity with Black people in the US, as well as emphasized that policing unfolds as a violent and murderous condition in their various respective contexts too. Names of Black people who lost their lives at the hands of police in the US were called and remembered in concert with names of Black people who lost their lives at the hands of police in other parts of the African diaspora. While many movements make these close connections, these connections are rather marginalized in theoretical and scholarly debates about policing in Europe. Drawing on theoretical reflections from my current research project on policing Blackness in continental Europe, I want to discuss some of these theoretical traditions and confront them with approaches from the Black radical tradition, mainly drawing on the work of anti-colonial theorist Frantz Fanon. Fanon has theorized how policing operates as method for the production of labor power through ongoing violence, force, and coercion. Finally, and by considering the transformation of policing as method, I end with a note on what we can learn from Fanon and theorists of the Black radical tradition in relation to the struggles for Black lives. Critical social theories of policing depart from very heterogeneous approaches and analyze the forms, effects, characteristics, and mechanisms of policing in relation to societal systems of power, exploitation, and oppression. And in many of these critiques, ranging from Marxist to rather post-structuralist approaches, police is understood as a societal relation of power, which reproduces discourses and ideologies of criminalization that go beyond the mere institution of police. Now, I want to briefly flesh out three of these approaches to exemplify how many of them miss to conceptualize the links between race and colonial capitalism. The first concerns various critical theories that consider the police one of the most fundamental pillars of Western bourgeois society, and one Marx's understanding of the police as central to the concept of security, as the supreme concept of class society. The police should help, quote, to guarantee to each of its members the preservation of his person, his rights, and his property, end of quote by Marx. However, as Mark Neocleous reminds us following Marx, police did not only play a functional role, but also a mobilizing role in the creation of a class of wage labor through the violent recruitment into a workforce and the fabrication of wage labor, for instance, through restriction of movement and vagabondage. Policing was thus not only responsible for protecting property relations, but for turning immediate producers into wage laborers. As Neocleous states, quote, the forms of policing being traced here were a political force for the making of the working class, in that the ultimate aim of the police project was the commodification of labor through the consolidation into the wage form, end of quote. Thus, the analysis of the mobilizing force of modern police provides a crucial framework to understand that policing is not only protecting the capitalist order, but is actively reproducing it. I'm struck by the lack of engagement with the role of racism, enslavement, and colonialism in these approaches, especially with regard to the question of violence. Black radical scholars and movements demonstrate and argue that the ongoing normalization of force, coercion, and violence through policing linked to the social reproduction of race did not disappear, as Marx suggested when arguing that the silent compulsion of the market discipline supersedes the need for coercion. Cedric Robinson argues that capitalism did not break with the feudal order, but rather builds on its racialism in the creation of the modern world political economic relations. So to Robinson, capitalism was racial because it builds and arranges feudalism's racialism into the capitalist form, constating that racial differentiation is intrinsic to capitalist value creation. Racialized capitalism perspectives help to analyze the, quote, constitutive role racism played in the formation and reproduction of capitalist modernity, end of quote by Satnam Virdry, and urge to reconsider the history of capitalist modernity from the perspectives of enslaved and colonized populations, including those within Europe, and especially their rebellions. Racialized capitalism perspectives urge to approach the mobilizing force of police to create wage labor through means of violence, not only as temporary or primitive, but as ongoing, through force, direct coercion, and brute violence. Whereas to Marx, direct and extra economic force would be supplanted by the silent compulsion of economic relations, and otherwise only used in exceptional cases, racialized capitalism perspectives are indispensable in helping to understand direct state-sanctioned force as ongoing, and to reorient the question of policing and organized state violence to the experiences of the wretched of the earth. It was indeed Frantz Fanon, in developing his theory of colonial violence, who argued that racialized subjects, especially the poor, experience policing as disproportionately violent, also in the everyday and not only at, for instance, protests or strikes. So as Fanon wrote in The Wretched of the Earth, the colonial world is a world cut in two. The dividing line, the frontiers, are shown by barracks and police stations. In the colonies, it is the policeman and the soldier who are the official institute go-betweens, the spokesmen of the settler and his rule of oppression. In capitalist societies, the educational system, whether lay or clerical, the structures of moral reflexes handed down from father to son, the exemplary honesty of workers who are given a medal after 50 years of good and loyal service, and the affection which springs from harmonious relations and good behavior. All these aesthetic expressions of respect for the established order serve to create around the exploited person an atmosphere of submission and of inhibition which lightens the task of policing considerably. In the capitalist countries, a multitude of moral teachers, counselors, and bewilderers separate the exploited from those in power. In the colonial countries, on the contrary, the policeman and the soldier, by their immediate presence and their frequent and direct action, maintain contact with the native and advise him by means of rifle butts and napalm not to budge. End of quote. Fanon points at the differential logic of policing here and argues that the relation between the colonized poor and the police is inherently violent, whereas the experiences of the white working class with the police is lightened, one could also say softer or silently compulsive. Fanon refers to the ongoing coercive violence through policing in the fabrication and mobilization of the colonial capitalist social formation. This also translates into questions of power. The second approach I would like to turn to concerns Michel Foucault's considerations of penal and disciplinary regimes, in which he argues that modern forms of power are characterized less by the exercise of physical force and violence than by discipline and dressage. While Foucault argued that the way in which power was exercised changed from more brute, public, and sovereign forms to rather softer and disciplining modes of power in the 18th century, the Black feminist Simone Brown shows that this shift only applies to certain subjects. In her important work, Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, Brown highlights how sovereignty and disciplinary power and the disciplining and regulation of Black subjects are entangled. She argues that while the penal regimes have changed for Foucault from sovereignty to forms of discipline, this does not apply to the historical formations of racialized power in the same way. I think when we consider the policing of the Black and racialized working class and non-working poor, and often open forms of brute and coercive violence that come with it, Fanon's and Brown's arguments also hold for various contemporary contexts of ongoing coercive violence through policing. The third point I would like to discuss concerns the dimension of subjectivation. In his work on ideological interpellation, Louis Althusser described the scene of modern subject formation through the interpellation by the police when shouting, "Hey, you there." It is through being hailed, through being interpellated by police, that the subject becomes a subject. The modern subject of rights and of the state is thus a subject constituted by and through police. Simultaneously, involved in the logic of law and order, the modern rightful subject not only recognizes, but further recognizes and desires itself as a subject with rights, and this includes property rights, that must be protected. Althusser, however, seems to ignore the racialized and also gender dimension of policing in his thoughts on interpellation as constitutive for modern subject formation. Let me spell out a thought experiment. Could it be that the subject in Althusser also turns around because he, pronouns on purpose, can be relatively sure that he will not experience repressive force by the police? How about individuals whose everyday is impregnated by direct or indirect control of the police? Isn't it most likely that they will try to escape from the control as they are not hailed as a state subject, but as an enemy of the state? Now, here is a banner from a protest in Paris in the struggle for justice for Théo Louaka and Adama Traoré, mainly waged in the urban racialized working and non-working poor districts of the French outer cities. The banner actually reads, "Théo and Adama remind us why Ziad and Bouna ran away." Théo Louaka was brutalized and sexually violated by the French police on the 2nd of February 2017, and Adama Traoré died in police custody on the 19th of July in 2016. And Ziad Benna and Bouna Traoré were actually the two youngsters that were electrocuted on October 27 in 2005. Some of you may remember actually the urban rebellions going on in many urban districts, deprivileged working class, racialized working class districts in 2005. So actually this banner shows us that it speaks to the condition of constantly being on the run from police, and not as a mode of subject formation as state subjects with rights, but rather as enemies of the state. Althusser's scene of subjection thus engages the modern subject as one with civil and property rights, or with at least a promise of these rights. Linking modern subject formation with the development of racial capitalism and its mode of policing and punishment, one can begin to understand that the policing of the racialized poor is constitutive for capitalist modernity, as well as for modern subject formation. Now, what the Bana and the many experience and theoretizations of Black, brown, and poor communities actually tell us is that we are interpolated by police differently alongside class relations and intersectional vectors of state violence, domination, and exploitation. This is actually the last passage. Black radical critiques of policing unravel the differential logics of policing that frame but appear to no longer define relations of production, and which are actualized in current neoliberal conjunctures, in which policing is more and more about, quote, policing of unwaged labor that has migrated to poverty and the informal economy, as Nikhil Pal Singh has written. Although policing as method has transformed from mainly mobilizing into wage and coerced labor to policing of the racialized working and non-working poor and rendered surplus populations as dangerous classes, racialized capitalism perspectives and critiques of policing remain important, as they reveal the centrality of coercive violence for maintaining capitalist social relations and subject formations. But they are also crucial for current struggles for Black lives, if the aim is to center poor Black people alongside struggles for other parts or sections of the wretched of the earth, and against the racialized and gendered mode of production and order of property that excludes the majority of the world's population from living a decent life. Black radical perspectives, and I explored the take of Fanon here, focus on the colonial class structure of racialized policing. This is important because even if it's racism that causes Black and brown communities to be policed disproportionately, it's racial capitalism that causes policing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn to the discussion comments, and we'll start with Professor Hall.
Hello, everybody. Okay, I've actually got a big picture of Emily and a tiny picture of me, but that's fine. Don't ask me why. So it's good to be here. I'm afraid I'm in a rather nervous state because my phone told me that I'm being scammed on my bank account. So I'm a bit anxious and it's rather distracted me from the extremely serious discussion that we're having. So forgive me if I'm not as coherent as I might be. I should say, by way of introduction, that the reason I'm here is that I've been working on questions of the relation between capitalism, race, and slavery for a long time now, and particularly through the work that we've done at the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project based in London. I'm speaking from London. I know people are speaking from all over the place, but I'm in London. And today in London, we had the latest report from our wretched government about race, which insists that there is no such thing as institutional racism. So it's very depressing, actually, because we're simply going round and round and fighting the same struggles that we've been fighting for many decades. Institutional racism was recognized as central to policing decades ago and is now being completely denied, though we have much evidence of its continuing. Anyway, so the work that I've been doing on slavery and capitalism relates quite closely to some of the things that Pepijn was introducing at the beginning of the session this afternoon. So whereas in the Netherlands, the argument has been that the Dutch weren't really involved with slavery. And as I understand it, it's still extremely difficult to talk about race openly in Dutch society. That's not the case in Britain, but in Britain, the orthodox story for generations has been that Britain led the way in abolishing slavery. And therefore, what we ought to be extremely proud of is our generosity, our liberty-loving traditions, the golden thread of our liberty, which has gone through our history, et cetera, et cetera. So a decade ago, we decided, a group at University College in the history department, we decided to tackle this question by looking at the significance of British slave owners and the money the money and ideas and racial practices which they brought from the Caribbean to Britain as a way of demonstrating the significance of British capital and British people in the development of the slave trade and slavery. And we did this initially through a study of compensation which was granted to all slave owners in 1835-36 by the British government, paid by British taxpayers. 20 million was paid, and half of that money stayed with residents in Britain who were, in other words, absentee slave owners. So we tracked those people, we did biographical work on them. We've created a database which has been very, very extensively used. We've had over 2 million hits on our database now with all this evidence about the wealth that came into Britain through compensation. And then in the subsequent study that we did, the wealth and the racial practices which came into Britain through the long-term ownership of estates and human property in the Caribbean by Britons. So that's the context for me, and the current work that I'm doing is that I'm writing a monograph called Making Racial Capitalism, which is about a British slave owner in Jamaica called Edward Long, who wrote a major history of Jamaica in the 18th century. And in this 3-volume history, he in fact describes, in my interpretation of it, he describes how racial capitalism works in the context of the mid-18th century. So one of the arguments I'm making in the book, which coincides very much with some of the things Pepijn's been saying in the paper I read, is that there's no such thing as stable entities that are either race or slavery or capitalism, and that what we need to understand is the specifics of those systems, where they're working, when they're working, how they're working. So how does, rather than thinking about racial capitalism as something that operates in the same way everywhere, how does it operate in the 18th century Atlantic? And how different is that from the 20th century or 21st century US? And the answer is, of course, very, very different. So that's my sort of introductory points, with my worries about the bank going on at the back of my head. So if I could come to what Pepijn had to say. Well, first of all, I'm very sympathetic to your insistence on rewriting Dutch historiography. And obviously for the reasons that we have projects all over Western Europe and of course in the US doing exactly that work, rewriting histories in order to rethink the centrality of race in its many different forms to these histories, and to tackle evasion and disavowal, which are so central to the way in which, I mean, I would argue in the British context, still central to the ways in which questions of race are avoided, evaded, as in the major report, which is brought out today by the British government, saying, you know, there is no institutional racism. I absolutely agree then that we have to think about capitalism and slavery as specific temporally and spatially, and race itself, which is an extremely capacious concept used in many different ways. And the distinction that you're drawing between the East and the West Indies is obviously crucial here. They're very different contexts, very different sets of social relations, not even just, you know, in the East and the West Indies, but I mean, for example, Trinidad and Guyana are very different from Jamaica, which is different again from Barbados. You know, you simply cannot generalize, or rather you can, but I don't think it's helpful to generalize unless we have a grasp of the Pacific. So in the paper that you sent us, and obviously you were moving on a bit from that today, the focus was very much on the organization of production and labor. And I'd like to hear more about the differentiated forms of racialization, which is what you just began to start with, to touch on today. So when the VOC expelled and exterminated the indigenous peoples in the Banda Islands, and you came back to this today, who were the new laborers that were brought in and how were they racialized? And was there a hierarchy of racialization as there is in Britain and in the whole across the entire British Empire, with Africans at the bottom and an entire, you know, different kinds of Africans again in another hierarchy? So I wanted to ask about the hierarchies of racialization and how that is, whether that is still played out in Dutch society, as it is, for example, in British society in particular ways. And then I wanted to ask, has the difference between a history of bonded labor and a history of slavery mattered? So of course, bonded labor is another form of unfree labor, but how have those distinctions mattered in terms of the organization of colonialism in the period in which you're working? And then one other thing, I mean, there are many, many questions I could ask, but one of the other questions I wanted to ask was that you just mentioned the significance of urban slavery. Well, one of the most interesting findings and most unexpected findings of our Legacies Project research has been the numbers of women slave owners of color in urban areas in the Caribbean. So, you know, a traditional picture of slave owners is that they're white men. Well, in fact, in Britain, the compensation that was granted, 25% of the people who got compensation were women. In the Caribbean, 40%, over 40% of the people who received compensation were women. And many of them were small-scale urban slave owners who were of color. And this obviously has had such a huge effect, actually, on the whole organization of the color hierarchy in the Caribbean, about which, of course, I could say a great deal. So let me go on to Emily. Well, when I first read this, Emily, I thought, what can I possibly say? This is not something I know anything about at all. You know, honestly, the limits of my knowledge are kind of, you know, essays by Nahisi Coates, etc., on, you know, which discuss redlining and so on and so forth. However, I did find I found your very brief summary, actually, at the beginning of what you said today, rather helpful. But I wanted to pick up on your use of Cheryl Harris, which of course is very widely read and a very significant essay. Indeed, it was a very long essay. But she, I'd like you to, well, no, let me go to Cheryl Harris first, actually. the emphasis in her classic exploration of whiteness as property is based on, of course, is based on the law. And so in your presentation, you did have a little bit to say about the law, because of course you referred to the Supreme Court judgment, for example, in 48, I think it was. But the debate that you've focused on doesn't centrally deal with the law. And I wondered if you've got things to say about the significance of the law in this context. But I also wondered whether you knew that it was Du Bois who first formulated the notion of whiteness as property. And I think you do know. Well, I'm glad, because so many people think it's Cheryl Harris that it all goes back to, and of course it doesn't. It goes back to Du Bois. And interestingly, it goes back to his essay on the souls of white folk in 1919, which was in the wake of the massacres in St. Louis, and has recently been written about very interestingly in Walter Johnson's new book, The Broken Heart of America, which is a wonderful book, which I strongly recommend. So the discovery of personal whiteness, whiteness as ownership, and whiteness as property is all developed by Du Bois, and then of course taken up by many, many other writers, and particularly more recently. But I wanted to ask about the significance of the law for you. And then I wanted to ask about the way in which aspects of liberalism have really, how liberalism is crucial to your argument, because the notion of individual, the individual and individual creditworthiness as opposed to structural matters depends on a liberal ideology. And so how significant do you think that continuation of liberalism is in this 21st century debate? I mean, I was very struck by how important the idea of creditworthiness was, even to the fair housing groups, when you would expect the fair housing groups to have a more radical critique of the structural nature of racial inequalities and the way that they've been played out in the housing market. So I thought perhaps you'd take that up. Let me just say something about Vanessa, and then go back to Jean Batu, who's not here, but since I had a think about him, perhaps I'll say it. So Vanessa, I do welcome your focus on the importance of, I've now lost my comments on that, your focus on social theory and the importance of that for your study. But I think it is, I do think it's also important that you think about the specific contexts and places from which these different theories have emerged. So Marx is writing in England in the mid-19th century, Fanon in colonial Algeria, Foucault and Althusser in late 20th century France, Brown in the 21st century US, etc. So, I mean, you're drawing on these very different notions that come out of really very different social and economic sets of relations. And I think that's important to your argument. The quotations that you use from, I think his name is Niklaus, I just I can't follow it, because the idea that the police had a mobilizing role in the making of wage labor, I mean, this is simply not true in the English context. In England, wage labor emerged out of the agrarian revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries. And what was crucial to that was the organization of the labor laws. So it was law that was really the key, and policing in the way that we now think about it did not emerge until the 19th century. So I don't know whether he's a theorist but he clearly is not a historian when he's saying these things. So I wanted you to talk some more about what you mean by policing as method. I understand the centrality of coercion and of state power, but it doesn't, I want you to think about the differences between how it operates in different societies. Remember that Fanon, in the very powerful quote that you use, when he's writing about Algeria, he talks about the police and the barracks, the military are absolutely critical to his ideas about violence and coercion and power. So how does the military sit in your analysis? How important do you think that is? And then I really wanted you to talk a bit about what the study that you're doing yourself in continental Europe. Are you concentrating on France or where? And if so, in France, how important do you think the colonial legacy of Algeria is? I imagine you think it's absolutely crucial, but perhaps you could say a little bit about that. Just 2 words about Jean Batou. Well, I suppose the main thing is that there's an awful lot of work that that he hasn't read and that he doesn't know about. So that to end his discussion with Eric Williams and Inikori is really by now, there's a wealth of historiography that I could point him to, that it would be very interesting for him to think about. And of course, what he's actually thinking about is capitalism as slavery. He's not actually thinking about racial capitalism as in the way in which that concept has been developed. Obviously, so many people using the terminology of Cedric Robinson, but also people like Walter Johnson and others, reworking Marx, rethinking Marx and Marx's own writing and arguments to focus more on the actual concrete relations of particular kinds of capitalists and particular kinds of slavery, rather than thinking about it at a very high level of abstraction. So let me stop there so that there's time for Michael.
Thank you very much. And I will also time myself. So I want to thank all the panelists for a deeply thoughtful and important set of papers that analyze historical, theoretical, and empirical excuse me, aspects of the intersection of race and capitalism. Learned quite a bit and was continually pushed to expand how I understand the questions raised and answered in each paper. The papers very usefully fall into 2 groups for me. The first group concentrates on the emergence of a system, what many have called a global system of racial capitalism. Some use the term racialized capitalism, colonial racial capitalism, Dr. Thompson, racial gendered capitalism. Both Batou and Brandon papers focus on the centrality or lack thereof, European participation in colonialism, the state, so slave trade and slavery for the emergence respectively industrial and commercial capitalism. While nearly a century ago, Eric Williams raised many of these questions with respect to Britain in the controversial and critically important book Capitalism and Slavery. The papers we have here today focus on the critical cases of France and the Netherlands. They both argue for a central role of slavery, the slave trade, and colonialism played in building capitalism, and Batou's case, including also industrial capitalism for both France and the Netherlands, as well as within the region more generally. Both papers also highlight, however, the particularities of how the process played out in each society. There are strong differences, for example, in how the Dutch participated in and built global racial capitalism as compared to the French, English, or Iberian societies. With respect to the slavery studies, a related set of questions: to what degree did European powers play in shaping modern global racial hierarchies, and to what degree did that process contribute both to the emergence of capitalism and the modern European state? Put another way, to what degree was the emergence of a global system of racial capitalism dependent on the co-constitutive process of the emergence of capitalism and partially already emerging global racial order, as we can see that order start emerging in the mid-15th century with 1444 in Portugal marking an important date. To what degree was the emergence of Western European capitalism inextricably entangled, at least historically, not necessarily theoretically, with global imperial projects? The second group of papers focus on the contemporary mechanisms by which the global system of racial capitalism is produced and reproduced today, allowing, for example, financial institutions to reap super profits through processes of what Inga Amata-Taylor has called predatory inclusion, resulting in fast super profits from predatory lending practices that target Black and brown communities in the US. One area of research in the intersection of race and capitalism that needs some work is a relative lack of study of this intersection within the context of contemporary finance capitalism, as contrasted to both historical and philosophical studies. Dr. Kutschestein's work combines political theory and historical analysis to help us focus on the mechanisms through which finance capital today reproduce and in some ways sharpen racial economic inequality while occluding the racialized nature of these mechanisms under the false veil of supposed neutral procedures. Further, Kutschestein shows how our analysis of the production of severe racial inequality in the domain of finance must go far beyond theoretically and politically a focus on bias and discrimination in financial markets. Kutschestein demonstrates how, for example, decades of racial injustice are bound within the supposedly neutral criteria of the credit score. These practices and their groundings in the functioning of financial and other markets, such as housing, leads Dr. Kutschestein to question the degree to which true economic equality can be achieved given current private market valuations, norms and practices, combined with the lack of outside accountability. She explicitly questions whether, given the above quote, whether it's possible to undo the concrete entanglements of racist and capitalist logics with which we find ourselves confronted within a framework that is still recognized to be capitalist, unquote. Dr. Thompson's presentation deepens our understanding of how, in the context of Europe and indeed globally, the coercive aspect of the racial state is an integral component of the global system of gendered racial capitalism. She addresses how several schools of critical inquiry that theorize the police fail with serious consequences to address the role of racial subordination and oppression. She also shows how racial capitalism approaches can be applied globally to policing, making the specific point that failure state coercion is not confined to the realm of original or primitive accumulation, but as Nancy Fraser, Jolie Melamed, Jolie Bird, and several of us have argued, also linked to ongoing processes of dispossession, expropriation, and capital accumulation. Excessive state cruelty directed at populations of the racialized other is linked to and a prerequisite for the ongoing regimes of predatory expropriation described by Kutschestein and others. The cruelty of the racial state is a fundamental necessity for the racialized hyperaccumulation of racial capitalist social orders. After analyzing shortcomings due to the lack of attention to racial subordination in Marxist, Foucault's, and Althusser's theorizing of the role of state coercion, policing, among other practices, Thompson directs our attention to the relevance of phenomenon for analysis of the violent state coercion directed at racialized and colonized populations, and recounting Fanon's description of the difference of the role of the police with respect to metropole white working class communities versus the colonized other. We see echoes of Du Bois' analysis in Black reconstruction of the policing of Blacks during slavery by largely poor and working class whites, as well as the benefits that contemporary urban and rural working class whites derive from being the workforce that in the US, drives the massive policing of racially subordinate communities and the prison guards that make possible mass incarceration, a material as well as psychic reminder of the wages of whiteness. In conclusion, with these opening comments before I turn to specific questions for each author, what is at stake is far more critical than an academic debate between abstract theorists. These debates speak directly to how we understand Trump's victory in the 2016 presidential elections and the racist, authoritarian, and potentially fascist phenomena of Trumpism and the rise of neo-fascist movements in the global North and South. It speaks to how we best understand in countries both in the global North and South the accelerating rates of inequality, popularly described by, among others, Thomas Piketty. What is at stake speaks to why you must criticize those who take the extreme position, as some of our colleagues in political science do, that paying attention to racial disparities and police murders diverts us from building working class unity, that fighting racism is antagonistic to building a progressive movement. The latter view has virtually no adherence among Blacks in the US, but they get comfort and cover for substantial a substantial segment of the US white left that continues as it has from the late 19th century to the present to ignore Black struggles for justice and either dismiss or attack Black activists. On the other hand, the Afro-pessimists, similar to some 20th century Black nationalists, have an equally ahistorical narrative that not only massively distorts the relationship of white supremacy to capitalism, insisting despite all historical and contemporary empirical evidence that the core logics of slave-based anti-Blackness exist, according to them, outside of and ultimately invariant to the dynamics of a capitalist political economy. This strand of theorizing has taken root, though, in real-world activism and spread its influence beyond the borders of the US. The Afro-pessimists are correct to insist the logics of racial domination are to some degree autonomous and not fully determined by capitalist social order. Those Marxists who have a totalizing view of capitalism and Afro-pessimists have both failed to understand the effects of the interaction of multiple systems of domination. It's our task to afford better theoretical and empirical weapons, not only to illuminate the nature of global racial capitalism, but also so we can help provide tools to combat the injustice that it produces. So to my questions. First, for Professor Brandon, I'm not a historian, so this may seem to be a naive question. One of the several aspects of the historical papers I read for today that I find exciting is being pushed to think more deeply about a Western European division of imperial labor and war. The Dutch, as you persuasively argue, were deeply implicated in producing, reproducing, and exploiting for expropriation and capital accumulation racial hierarchies in Africa and Asia. Swin Beckert, in his work on the global history of continent capitalism, developed the concept of war capitalism, described a period others have labeled mercantile commercial capitalism, which is also a period you analyze for us today. First, is Becker's concept of war capitalism useful? More importantly, however, can you say more about the role that inter-imperial rivalry and conflict played in shaping what some would call an imperial project of global racial capitalism? With respect to the Dutch case, say more about the role of what you call commercial partnerships played in that process. Secondly, you describe how in the auspices of the Dutch East India Company, the population of the Bandit Islands was exterminated and then slaves were brought in to farm nutmeg. This is, of course, in the Spice Islands on the other side of the world from the Caribbean. Yet that is a process that Western Hemispheric indigenous study scholars, Caribbean study scholars, and scholars of racial capitalism find very familiar. What are the similarities and differences between the processes you describe and those in the Bandit Islands and those in the Western Hemisphere with respect to dispossession, genocide, and slavery, with respect to what some colleagues have labeled colonial racial capitalism? Here are my questions for my colleague, Dr. Katzenstein. You state, and I quote, debates about the political implications of using a racial capitalism approach have taken place at a fairly high level of abstraction and have been dominated by the question of whether racism is necessary and inherent feature of capitalist social orders. The question you say that is somewhat misplaced question, that for you, the question that is most pressing is, quote, not whether the capitalism is always necessarily a racist, it's not whether capitalism is always necessarily racist, but whether it's possible to undo the concrete entanglements of racist and capitalist logic with which we find ourselves confronted within a framework that is still recognizably capitalist. I find that shift useful. And what I want to ask is first, what are the implications of your study, both what you sent to us today, but also your larger study for property rights regimes, given both your empirical and theoretical insights, and given that you powerfully argue, quote, a commitment to the market as a primary tool for valuing futures and a defense of structures of profitability place strict limitations on addressing the reproduction and exacerbation of racial inequality in the housing finance market, unquote. What do your findings suggest about whether it's possible to undo the entanglements you described within a framework that is recognizably capitalist? My second question is that, as you know, I work both quantitatively and theoretically on support and opposition to reparations for African Americans in the US. One of my key empirical findings, one that has held steady for a very long time, that there is a massive white resistance to even an apology for slavery or Jim Crow, mirrored by equally strong support for such an apology. Given the racial chasm and the reluctance of many white citizens to either recognize or discuss historical or contemporary racial injustice? How do we begin a conversation about moving past the credit they deserve to talk about the raising of risk, the type of institutional and other changes, including the right to not only hold accountable, but govern financial institution practices, evaluation, and risk assessment, particularly given the near sacred status in the US of not only private property, but the expertise of financial firms, faith in markets to adjudicate even normative political questions, and Hayek-like suspicion of political bodies and similarly ability to make good and fair decisions when it comes to finance and the economy. I also have two questions for Dr. Thompson. The first is, are Marx's, Foucault's, and Althusser's analysis of coercion redeemable? We modify them to centrally include analysis of the role of policing and other forms of racialized state coercion, or their lack of understanding and consideration of racialized oppression, make their analysis not useful for understanding policing within the context you have labeled global gendered racial capitalism. The reason I ask is those such as Walter Johnson, Nancy Fraser, and others are rethinking Marxism, as Professor Hall has suggested, through the lens of racial capitalism, or in Fraser's case, racialized capitalism, to try to recover and move forward analysis that is sympathetic to, if not fully based on Marxism. If not, how can we further incorporate theories of racial coercion and violence into our various theorizing of the interaction between racial subordination, capitalism, and patriarchy in the racial state? My second question, one of the key questions me and my colleagues have wrestled with, certainly a weakness in how many of us on the other side of the Atlantic have addressed theorizing racial capitalism, is a lack of theorizing of how patriarchy as a system of domination is articulated with capitalism and white supremacy. Brilliant scholars such as Sadia Hartman have done so, but outside of a racial capitalism theoretical framework. Can you say more about the concept of racial gender capitalism that you invoke? Those are the end of my comments, and the panel is free if it wishes to address any or all of the questions that the two of us addressed to you. And we'll go in the order of the presentations.
So these are huge questions. First of all, I want to express my admiration to Catherine about how composed you are with the messages that you've received. I would have run probably, but and thank you for the comments. You mentioned the difficulty of speaking about race and racism in a Dutch context, and I think that is very similar to the issues surrounding discussing race in France or in Spain. There's many similarities there, but I also want to say that this is not sort of unchangeable. I want to give one example that of this, that in last June we had to submit the manuscript of a book for the city of Amsterdam, commissioned by the city of Amsterdam, for a project that I coordinated, which was investigating the city of Amsterdam's role in slavery. And this book is supposed to lead up to formal apologies by the city of Amsterdam, which will follow probably on the 1st of July, Emancipation Day, for the city of Amsterdam's role in slavery, both in Asia and in the Atlantic world. And with my co-editors, we made sort of the silence about race one of the key points in the introduction, saying one of the reasons why we can't discuss the legacy of slavery, why there's so much difficulty to deal with this, is the impossibility to speak about race. So we sent this in actually the day of the large Black Lives Matter mobilization in Amsterdam. And the whole month after that, there were demonstrations everywhere in the Netherlands, and there was not a newspaper that didn't have race in the headlines on the front page for weeks on end. The Dutch prime minister in parliament was forced to say there is systemic racism in the Netherlands. So in a couple of weeks, the introduction that we had written, where we made this point, but of course in all the sort of, it's impossible to speak about this and we have to learn how to speak about this, felt so outdated. So we had a committee reading this, commenting it to us and saying, well, yes, but look at the newspapers. And we had to rewrite the introduction to actually fit the moment and actually put Black Lives Matter in. So these things are shifting, and they're, of course, most of all, they're shifting not because of academic debates, but they're shifting because of what's happening through social movements. But it does have an effect on debates. So it means that slavery is very much discussed now in Dutch historiography, other than that's a sea change from the state of affairs 10 years ago, but still not race, racialization, racism as a central element of that. That is extremely lacking behind. So many of these questions that you ask me, I would say this is work that still has to be done, thinking about the specifics. And I absolutely agree with you how important this is, and that was part of sort of my paper, as you mentioned, which was what I did not present here, is of course thinking about the specifics of slavery in different conditions in Asia from the Atlantic world. But I want to think about this in terms of both the specifics and connections. So there is a big difference, not so much with the Banda Islands, but the Banda Islands were quite unique in the Asian context for being an experiment in plantation slavery, where that followed genocide of the original population, and where the Europeans had this sort of free hand in creating a new set of social conditions and introducing slavery, which is very different from many other contexts where actually the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, did engage in plantation slavery, not just slavery. But on these plantations, very often, there were enslaved people, there were people who were indentured laborers, there were people who worked in corvée labor relations in surroundings where the Dutch East India Company often was the weaker power next to Asian societies that had their own rules as to enslavement, when people could be enslaved, when not, their own ideas about social hierarchies, of course, most famously caste, and the sort of the possibilities and restrictions on enslavement that entails, with which the Dutch East India Company was in a process of negotiation. And that is very different from the context of, let's say, Suriname, which was basically created as a plantation colony based on African slavery, where the Dutch didn't face these sort of these forms of restrictions, and different ideas about hierarchies emerged, etc. And that is true, and that has an enormous impact on, I think, the sort of race thinking in these contexts. But there's also continuous processes of circulation. And I'm thinking, for example, about the very, well, in a way, connecting to what Vanessa said, Vanessa Thompson, on sort of policing. This is about sort of the use of passports to restrict the mobility of laborers, the kind of sanctions for escaping the plantations. There is this sort of also this legal transfer of ideas from one side of the world to the other, and I think we should do much better in thinking about sort of both these aspects, both the sort of the borrowing, seeing similarities without flattening this out, and thinking that there is sort of one history of enslavement, and then that sort of the need for the specifics, of course, also applies to capital and how capital evolves with slavery, because that is sort of one of my there is this internalist vision of sort of thinking about the roots of capital within Europe, and capital existed before colonization within sort of the northern Low Countries, but I think it's a problematic idea that the capital that operated in a brewery in Amsterdam in the mid 15th century is the same animal as the capital that operates in the mid 17th century for the West India Company, or the capital in the 18th century that funds through private streams, funds the establishment of plantations. And what makes it so different? in part, and of course this is only a very partial answer, but in part the immense capacity to exert control over human lives, control over nature, control over elements beyond the immediate sphere of production. And well, this is just my vision, but that sort of development could only take place at that scale by the fusion of sort of capital with the colonial, and that seeing how sort of the colonial transforms and the racial transforms how capital operates, I think can also provide a way to think about how this then shapes capitalism in the metropole, right? How the colonial conditions transforms what capital is and how it functions functions there. I'll leave it at that. There's of course much more to say.
Thank you. Dr. Kassenstein?
Yeah, thank you for those questions and the comments. They open up a lot of different, I think, stories and historical and theoretical reflections. Maybe I'll take up kind of the importance of law. So to give a bit of background to this one specific paper, it's kind of it's part of a larger book project at this point that really tries to trace how particular ways of thinking about how particular ways of thinking about risk and creditworthiness become entangled with different conceptions of racial injustice, and specifically kind of racial economic injustice, and tries to kind of tell a longer historical story that pays a lot of attention to the ways in which the particular kind of discourses that we've inherited about how to challenge racial economic injustice, both how to challenge it kind of legally, but also how to challenge it politically, how those discourses are themselves kind of a result of kind of a number of different historical struggles that of course always already take place in a set of, or that always have very specific kind of discursive, legal, political tools, right, at their disposal. And so you have kind of this sedimented way of the link between risk, race, and creditworthiness, essentially. And that's what I'm trying to tease out and figure out what that does politically, how it is both limiting and also productive, right? In many ways, I think the tools that we've inherited, the ways of challenging the link between race and risk, of course, they're not just problematic, right? They're also incredibly rich and have done a lot of work, very good work. And so that just as a kind of background to this paper. And
it just makes, can I just say, it just makes me think in an interesting way about, because I've looked at the debates on credit and risk and debt in the 18th century. And of course there it's all about class. It's not about race. But anyway, interesting.
Yeah, and so maybe to kind of briefly respond to your question about kind of the importance of law. Of course, you're right. It doesn't play a particular role in this paper, but yeah, it's all over the story, of course, right? Because I mean, you have a number of different kind of number of different ways in which law comes in, right? So of course, there is kind of the story about the legal apparatus that basically props up racist practices in the housing market and the housing finance market. You have a story of the development of anti-discrimination law, right? And the ways in which anti-discrimination law, again, kind of enables certain kinds of challenges, but forecloses others, right? I mean, specifically, if you think about, for example, disparate impact as one way of challenging racial economic injustice, right? It is always limited by a provision that disparate impact only counts as something that is legally actionable if it is if basically, if it cannot be justified according to business reasons, right? So here again, kind of economic rationality always constitutes kind of the outer limit of what can be recognized as a form of legally actionable racial injustice. And then, of course, there is a whole set of legal regulations around the financial markets that play a huge role in this, because they basically govern how risk is commodified, right? How it's transferable, who remains kind of on the hook if something goes wrong, right? And so like the legal stories is super important for kind of the structures of appropriation and accumulation that underpin the entire market. So yes, that is definitely a big part of the story. And then maybe just to turn really briefly to Michael, to your question about reparations. And if I understood you correctly, it was really a question about how can we turn the conversation beyond this framework of kind of the credit they deserve, kind of in the face of this really broad political opposition to even pretty minor commitments to kind of racial justice as a form of reparative justice. Is that fair?
That's very fair.
Okay. So, I mean, first of all, I want to say that I'm not particularly optimistic, right, that this is going to be done, or that it's feasible and politically likely in the near future. I think there are some moments in the history of struggles against racial discrimination in the housing finance market and the housing market that open up kind of alternative ways of envisaging kind of the relationship between, or that open up different ways of kind of challenging racial economic injustice, basically, right? That seem to me to be more productive than this constant refrain of to each according to their creditworthiness. All of them remain limited in the end, right? So I'm thinking, for example, of things like the community reinvestment movement, right? But are more expansive in the demands that they make in terms of expanding control over practices of valuation, expanding control over financial institutions, right? So I think if we want to think beyond kind of the credit they deserve, and if we want to do it in ways that can have some political resonance, then we would do well to turn to these examples where we already have kind of concrete ways that have resonated. So that's obviously a very, very incomplete answer, but I think it's the best I can do.
Professor Thompson?
Yes, thank you so much for these comments. I would like to start with giving some reply to Catherine Hall. Thank you very much. Obviously, my aim is not to go through these kind of approaches historically, but it's rather looking at continuities. So I am very aware of when actually these theories were put forward, but what is interesting for me are continuities and ruptures. And this, of course, is part of like post-colonial theories, or even or all kinds of critical theories when it is about looking at how systems of power, exploitation, appropriation, dehumanization have actually outplayed in several contexts, various contexts, historically, spatially, temporally, but also have certain continuities. And that's actually what I'm interested in. Now, concerning the question of, and I mean, I think there are also maybe many examples to also think about, of course, the specific context, but also the global circulations in terms of knowledge formations, but also in terms of policing practices. Mark Neocleous is actually, he is a political economist and critical theorist who wrote a very important book on policing called The Critical Theory of Police Power. And I think maybe I didn't make this obvious enough, that I'm not talking about the modern institution of the police, how we know it was actually founded or constituted at the beginning of the 19th century, what Foucault has brilliantly, I think, laid out in his work on governmentality, but rather about certain practices of discipline. And I completely agree that with regard to Marx, it was about bloody legislation, but he also talks about bloody discipline in terms of the recruitment into wage labor. And these are kinds of practices that can be understood in critical theories of policing as forms of policing in terms of practices, regulations, etc. Because of course, law has to be put into practice somehow. So Neocleous comes from this arrangement of bloody legislation and bloody discipline. So what I actually then am interested in looking at, okay, how do these critical theories of policing actually ignore the racialized structures in these processes? Or how can we confront these critical theories of policing from different times, yes, with Black radical critiques, to see in a way how race was written out and how it is important to reconfigure them in a Fanonian method. I mean, he talks about stretching Marxism. And I think because in terms of how I try to think about the recruitment into wage labor, because Marx would argue actually that this kind of coercive force would vanish. And with the example of Fanon, I'm actually showing, well, from the perspective of the colony or from the perspective of the poor colonized, it actually doesn't vanish. And then the question is, what does that tell us for today in terms of the differential logic of policing, right? And also the ongoing forms of violence. That doesn't mean that they do not change. I'm not making an argument for absolute continuation, but I'm thinking about the continuities and discontinuities and the kind of ruptures. And the question of violence, here we see it also with regard to, of course, Foucault, who was thinking in terms of discipline from a specific situation and context, historically also speaking, that is true. And Simone Brown confronts Foucault's disciplinary regime not only from a contemporary moment, but she confronts actually the modern institution of the prison and discipline, what he refers to panopticon and Jeremy Bentham, by thinking the prison from, for instance, the slave ship, as we know that Jeremy Bentham was also traveling on these slave ships. So it's not just a kind of well, this was in the past and this is in the present, but it is rather engaging theories that could maybe confront specific theories from their context, from a kind of underside, so to speak, of these approaches. The question of the military and policing, I think, is a very crucial one. And also here, I wouldn't say that it's exactly the same. Nobody's making that argument. For me, the differentiations, but also the continuities are important. However, Fanon already saw a kind of, in this quote and in The Wretched of the Earth, in general, a kind of working together, a kind of very close proximity between policing and militarization and the military. This is not only in the case of Algeria. Actually, this was not valid, but it actually counts for several colonial contexts. And I think it is interesting to look at that, because when we talk about the militarization of the police, in various contexts, for instance, of the global north, Paris would be a good example, France in general, but also Germany is like really speeding up in that regard, then we can see from a Fanonian perspective that this is actually not so new. When we think of how police and military actually functions also together. So the whole debate around the militarization of the police, which we like see unfolding in, for instance, critical theories of policing, I think there it's also important to historicize the question of the militarization of the police. And in terms of Althusser, this for me is just an important point, again, with the notion of subjectivation, that for Althusser, who made a quite general argument, universal argument, so to speak, around modern subject formation, to really show, okay, what can we actually learn about a constant way of running away from the police in terms of being subjected by policing differently. So it's actually what I did. I tried to like take 3 schools and see, okay, what actually happens if we confront them with lived realities when it comes to the poster from the banlieues, but actually also radical Black critiques from the so-called underside of theorizing and what we can actually learn from that. In regard to my own research, so this is actually really something I'm thinking about conceptually in terms of how has policing being conceptualized theoretically in different traditions and schools, and how can we confront them, or are they even to confront from a Black radical tradition? So it's very much also a Fanonian methodology, who also actually worked through Marx, Hegel, and Sartre from the perspective of the colonized, so to speak. And I think this maybe comes also to your question, Professor Dawson, in terms of can we redeem or rethink Marxism? I think both. I would really say in terms of Fanon, what does it mean to stretch Marxism? I mean, like he does in Black Skin, White Mask, but also then in The Wretched of the Earth, to say, okay, when it comes to certain questions, we need to stretch Marxism. And I think that's a lot of what also actually radical Black Marxist scholars did. And concerning the question of racial gendered capitalism, to me, the gendered is important there. Like you said, very important Black feminist theories, Saidiya Hartman, but also, of course, Hortense Spillers and many more have already shown how these systems of exploitation are gendered and actually are also based on racialized and gendered hierarchizations. And of course, the whole tradition of Marxist feminism comes in there in terms of the question of reproductive labor and a kind of feminized, devalued labor, I think, which is of course important for the accumulation of capital. So yes, thank you, sir, very much for the questions, and I hope I could clarify some points.
We don't have any remaining questions from the audience. I incorporated the one we had into one of my questions to the panelists. So if not, I thank you all for an extraordinary panel. This has been lively and invigorating, and I hope we can do it again in the future and keep these ties and thoughts in circulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing it.
Thanks.
That's Arnaud.
Thank you so much.
Thank Arnaud and Francois.
Bye. It was nice to meet everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, nice to meet you all.